Shihoko Ogawa, Program Director at Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. In case of fire, hope not, do not use the lift. Please go downstairs and then assemble on the other side of the road. And also, if you left any valuable things in the cloakroom downstairs, no one's watching it, so please go and wallets, computer, cameras, don't leave it in there. So nobody's left anything important there. Okay, great. Right, so let me introduce today's speaker, who's just standing right there, Dr. Gitte Marianne Hansen. She stayed in Japan with her husband about 4 or 5 years and observed Japanese women, I think. But now the book she brought today, Femininity, Self-Harm and Eating Disorders in Japan, not really a very sort of, how can I say, the light topic. It could be quite a serious thing if you self-harm yourself. Gitte is a lecturer in Japanese studies at Newcastle University and an associate researcher at Nordic Institute of Asia Studies, NIAS, which is University of Copenhagen. So is that your homeland?
That's my home country, yes.
Okay. And she holds a PhD from University of Cambridge. From 2004 to 2008, she studied and worked as a teaching and research assistant to Professor Norihiko Kato at Waseda University in Tokyo. Her work focuses on Japanese culture since 1980, especially issues related to gender and character construction in literature, manga, and other forms of narrative and visual culture. Her current project focuses on women and female characters in the world of Haruki Murakami. Haruki Murakami, I think most of you know about him, quite popular in this country. Now, Femininity, Self-Harm and Eating Disorders in Japan, Navigating Contradiction in Narrative and Visual Culture, is her first book, and then we have the copies here today. Because this is an academic book, it's quite expensive, but we have a special price of £70, originally £90 I think, but special reduced price of £70 today, which is available tonight. However, I'm not going to talk a lot about it, so can I hand it over to you, Gitte, please?
Thank you.
Would you like to come here and
Yes.
talk? Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. The book is also available at libraries. I think that's probably why most people would like to consult it, which is absolutely fine. So, yes, today I'm going to talk about my recently published book. And in connection with that, there are a few people and organizations I would like to start by thanking. So the Gates Cambridge Trust kindly sponsored my project for 4 years, it's 3.5 years. And then the Sasakawa Foundation has also contributed a few times. And finally, Newcastle University and the humanities faculty there. But more importantly, I feel I need to thank their artist who provided their front cover picture. This is by an illustrator called Kondo Miwa, and the image is from a picture book from 2011 called Itadakimasu. The picture itself, or the image book, has nothing to do with eating disorders, but when I saw this image, I felt it was really spot on for my front cover. I don't know, what do you see here? Do you see, what kind of character do you see? Do you see a girl, a boy? What do you see?
A girl.
A girl? How many people see a girl?
It's very, very androgynous.
Yeah? Yeah. I saw a girl as well. The artist said, you can use the picture, but it's actually a boy. So I thought, okay, so I was thinking about that for a while, and I thought, well, maybe that's even more perfect, because this is a lot to do with gender and a lot to do with finding one's feet in gender. out here it's not very clear, but out here it says, Sono inochi o itadakimasu. I consumed that life, or I received that life. Which I also thought was very saying for what I'm going to talk about, because this has a lot to do with consumption in many ways. So the reason I became interested in this topic was I was living in Tokyo at the time, and I noticed more and more places where I would see this topic pop up in situations where I didn't expect it. This is the front cover for a lifestyle magazine called Papyrus from 2009, and I don't know how clear the image is to you in the back, but this is not really your typical front cover picture, because something is slightly wrong. The character is, I think most would agree, way too thin, and she's also way too vulnerable with the cuts that she's made herself. Does anybody know who this is? This is a very famous singer, and also she also has done some films. Her name is Coco. And eating disorders and self-harm is a big part of her personality, or her self-promotion, if you like. She uses it a lot in her lyrics, she uses it in her films. The fans are very aware of this issue. And I will say that she's both a victim and a victimizer. She's both, looks like a victim, but at the same time, and she of course abuses her body, but at the same time, because she's the agent, she's also the one responsible for this abuse. So just to give you an example of one of her songs from 1997, like this: no matter how much blood I threw up, the answer was nowhere. So this I found very interesting, and I started wondering, what is the motive? Why would Papyrus put this kind of image on the front cover? Is it to put focus on contemporary issues? Is it to try and break down a taboo? Is it to display Coco's personal sufferings or similar sufferings? Or is it to sell magazines? Well, either way, eating disorders and self-harm becomes lifestyle products that can be consumed as entertainment through this kind of image. I think because, of course, magazine will never do anything without also anticipating some kind of profit. In the end, they need to survive. So today I'll introduce the book, and I've really tried to cut away all the theory, so bear with me if some people are sitting wanting some more theory. Please read the book. So I've really tried to cut that away, because I think it becomes a much more interesting conversation I can have with you if I cut that away. So a little bit about eating disorders and self-harm in the Japanese context, then move on to normative femininity and the thematization in Japanese culture, and it'll become very clear why I have this part in the research. And then finally, eating disorders and self-harm and thematizations in Japanese culture. And then I think we'll have some time for some discussion and some questions at the end. Okay? So the context of contemporary Japan. Of course, the first questions we should ask is, when is this? How many are they, and who are they? And these are very simple questions to ask, but they're actually quite difficult to answer, because the most clinical surveys are quite problematic. First of all, they tend to rely on self-report questionnaires, so that requires the individual to be willing to disclose this kind of information, and also to be willing to see there is an issue. So there's a lot of, we cannot really trust the information we can find there. Also, official medical definitions are very limiting. There's no international standard for diagnosis. So, for example, in the US, you can have a higher body mass index and still be diagnosed with anorexia than you can in Japan, and other nations as well. So this is very specific. Also, for example, for bulimia, you have to throw up a consistent amount of time, for say 3 months, at least 3 times a week, and many people with these issues actually go up and down. So that means they are not diagnosed. So diagnosis does not really help us much, because too many people we then cannot include. However, from these surveys, and I'm not a medical doctor at all, so I just read them and then put them to the side, but what it seems like is that we have a clear increase of the incidence since 1980. In comparison, the UK is more like the 60s or the 70s. Also, what we can see is that while there are some men, it's mostly women, or at least until recently it's been mostly women, but there's clearly diversity. This is not just young girls, it's also housewives, working women, and all sorts of women, actually. So I wanted to find out more about these women, what they were thinking. So I started reading letters, interviews, essays, blogs, these kind of things. And from that, it became apparent that although they have this diversity, it's a lot of different women, many of the women were saying similar things. What they were saying was that they felt they were receiving contradictive messages about femininity and about norms. They said that they expressed some kind of fragmentation about how to be female. So basically, on one hand, they feel they have to be self-sacrificing. On the other hand, they feel that they have to satisfy individual desires. Object versus subject, passive versus active, traditional femininity versus a new femininity, or family versus personal career. So these two and this is of course very broadly speaking, but this is what we can see from these kind of information. So, while eating disorders and self-harm are considered non-normative or sick behaviors, for the women who throw up, starve, or cut their own bodies, their acts are somehow tied to normative femininity. And so that's why my field is not just about eating disorders and self-harm, but very much about norms and normative femininity. And the book is actually divided into two equally big sizes. One deals with norms, which is much more difficult, and the other with eating disorders and self-harm. Right, so contemporary normative femininity. This is, of course, something that is really difficult to define because women can live in many ways. There is not just one model. Normative femininity is obviously not singular, but plural. This is why a lot of studies in gender studies have focused on the not mainstream, because it's much more easier to take a group that looks like each other and study that group and say something about that group. Trying to say something about the norms is a really scary area that most tend to avoid. And as one scholar in Japanese studies, Sabine Frühstück, has said, this is why we know much more about the not mainstream than the mainstream. So I decided for this study it's really important to try and have something that we could use as an easy, practical tool to talk about normativity. So I looked into different sociologists and different historians working on Japanese culture. Ueno Chizuko is a Japanese feminist who's worked a lot on women. And she and many others, they were identifying that they said it all in different ways, but basically what they were saying is that navigating contradiction is a key competence that women today must manage. So basically what they were saying is that women have to be both objects and subjects. They have to be passive and they have to be active. They have to be quiet, but at the same time they have to be vocal, and so forth. So in order to try and use this in a practical way, because I wanted to deal with theory and move on to something a bit more practical, I developed this term, contradictive femininity, to try and capture what they were saying, this navigating contradiction as a key competence that women have to deal with. So, contradictive femininity, for real women, I think that can lead to significant pressure. Most women manage it well. They have to manage both a career and family, or at least dream about one while doing the other. But for characters in narrative and visual culture, I found that that's often not problematic at all. In fact, it seems very straightforward. And then I started looking at character construction theories and found that there are basically three. character construction techniques that thematize this contradiction for women. And that's all tied to the classical doppelganger motif. You don't need to focus on that. I won't come back to it too much more, but this is what ties everything together in my book. So basically this ability for characters to construct several selves. And there are 3 construction techniques that I identified. One is double and multiple characters, extended characters, and transforming characters. And I'll leave you to look at 1 and 2 if you want to look at the book later, and then I'll give you some examples from the 3rd category, transforming characters. So transforming characters are one individual character that navigates contradiction via its own transformativity. So it's able to transform itself in the story. It transforms between opposing qualities or positions and manages everything by itself. Sometimes this can include explicit fantastic elements, so shape-shifting, the sudden appearance of wings or something else that makes it possible to manage this mess of contradictions in a way that we're not used to in the real world, because we can't suddenly transform into some superwoman. Sometimes it's simply just an apparent reality. And I say apparent because it isn't reality, but when you look closer into the story, you wonder, how did she manage to do all this and at the same time pick up the child at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? So something often does not really hold if we were to make a timeline or something like that. The point is, these characters manage it all, sometimes with difficulty, but this is what they aim to do. So let's look at an example. This is a manga by Moyoko called Hatarakiman. It was running in 2004 to 2007. And it was also a TV anime on Fuji Terebi in 2006 and a TV drama in 2007. Basically, this is the story about a young woman who is working at a magazine, and she wants to become a manager before she's 30. At the same time, she has her boyfriend whom she needs to meet up with, because one must have a boyfriend, which she is constantly being told by her friends as well. And so the whole story is about her balance to struggle, her struggle to balance these 2 sides of herself. And it's a very realistic story where we see her falling asleep in the train on the way to meeting the boyfriend and struggling to cook for him, because of course she should be cooking for him as well. The boyfriend is very supportive, which is of course nice for her. One of the moments where she is transforming is this. Even though this is a very realistic story, the story has incorporated these kind of fantastic elements to show the actual transformation. So in this scene, she's just been given a new important journalistic job, and she's really excited and ready to forget about her date. And she gathers energy and stretches up her arm like this, and and then she becomes to this kind of superwoman, like a transformation, just like Superman. Hatarakiman is what they call her, which means something like a working man. Her colleagues call her this because they're on the one hand impressed with her ability to work, on the other hand she's a little too masculine. And here also she is pushing the male button and turning into this Hatarakiman, and she's now able to work like a man. So switching from one side to the other side. So this is just one example of the many different works I've worked with in that side of the book. Some of the other things that I've dealt with deal, for example, Murakami Haruki, which I'm obviously working on in a different project now, and also other manga, and Bando Mariko, who is, does anybody know her? She's a very prominent businesswoman, and she wrote this book that became very bestseller about how women can become dignified. So very broad mix of things I looked at. I just wanted to give you one example of manga because it's very easy to give a visual image. So when women say, women who harm their own bodies say they get mixed messages about femininity, their feelings seem to make much sense from these kind of stories. Messages about femininity are highly contradictory, thematized through variations of this doppelganger motif, which is one of the stories I just showed you. And these are available across genre and cultural hierarchy in Japanese culture. So what I wanted to show in the book is that this is not just a story we find in manga, but a story we find in many different, repeated in many different ways through different mediums. Right, so now we've looked a little bit at this construction of normative femininity. But what is the point between normative femininity and eating disorders and self-harm? If we make a very simple, very simple way of trying to look at what the connections are here, we have normativity on one side and the sick or the unfeminine on the other side. And let's see what's happened if somebody who has eating disorders or self-harm has to be too willing to tolerate pain, whereas being willing to tolerate some pain is actually considered very normal and very feminine. So for example, acts like hair waxing, shaping underwear, high heel, pointy shoes, piercing, and cosmetic surgery. Again, being willing to deprive the body is also important for contemporary femininity, so dieting or effort to trim the body. Whereas being too willing to do this is what we call eating disorders, so throwing up, self-starvation, overexercising. And the same is the case for behavior, so self-control versus too self-controlled, sacrificing for others versus too self-sacrificing for others, submissive and too submissive. I think this is very clear that these two can be grouped in this way. The problem occurs when we want to try and define where it differs. Is the borderline here? Is it over here? Or is it over here? This is something that becomes virtually impossible to define because it depends on time, specific subculture, specific context, and all we can say is that there is some kind of gray space in the middle between the normative and the sick. And I think maybe cosmetic surgery is the act that best illustrates this, because if we think about just 10 years ago in Japan, or other places than Japan for that matter, and today, and if we imagine 10 years from now, what will be normal to put your own body through. So if we return to the example I gave you and look a little carefully about how she is constructed, it becomes clear that just from her body, without knowing the story, she's actually extremely skinny. The story has nothing to do with eating disorders, it's nothing to do with self-harm, it has everything to do with this contemporary issue women face, but at the same time there is something that is never to, can never be compromised. Right? You could both be a housewife or you could be a working woman, and you can be normative. But normativity, while normativity is plural, there are two competences that cannot really be compromised. One is appetite control and slimness. The other is pain tolerance and self-reproach. These are competences that are very important to do to a normal extent. So in contemporary Japan, women must navigate contradictive femininity on a thin line in gray zones between the normative and the sick. And this is where we can return to Koko, because the reason we don't recognize this image as a normative front cover is because she's crossed this line. She's too skinny for us to accept this as a normal front cover, and her cuts on her arms are clearly not how it should be. So if we return to the women and what they were saying about their own situation, they were saying contradictive messages about femininity is what they were given. And they were also saying that they feel fragmented about how to be female. In addition to these two main points, I also found that they tend to express that they have this alien invader inside of them. There's an internal conflict, two sides or two selves. These sides and two selves tend to be very gendered. So they experience one side as ultra-feminine or anti-feminine, or some experience this as one side is female, the other side is male, one side is neutral, and the other side is female. These kind of dichotomies. There seems to be a constant war between this real self and a monstrous invading intruder, where the body becomes this battlefield. Then they also said that they, through the acts, they can overcome feeling dirty and become clean. So now I'd like to turn more to how eating disorders and self-harm are thematized in culture, Japanese culture today. Basically, this started in line with reality. So about 1980 is when we see the first images or stories. From this time onwards, private experience, women's private experience, are becoming public discourse to be consumed as information, lifestyle, and entertainment. And this is not necessarily negative words, because this can also mean a way of overcoming personal issues. I have not worked at all with whether these images are making women do these behaviors. I think it could just as well be that they are learning to overcome them through these images. But what we can see is that across genre and cultural hierarchies, so again, from literature, manga, anime, film, TV drama, lyrics, and so forth, we can find this theme. And basically there are two types, explicit storylines and embedded storylines. So first, explicit storylines. These are stories that revolve around characters' very explicit acts. Often they are used as a form of marketing and promotion, a little bit like Koto, the image we saw Koto. When I say promotion, I don't mean promotion in the sense that do like me, but the story is sold because it is dealing with this topic, and it is clearly aimed at people who are interested in this topic. Often these kind of stories reference real women's lives. So in the story, contradictive femininity will be a conflict, split selves as alien invaders, feeling dirty and becoming clean. These are all themes that we can see in the fictional world, just like we can find them in the worlds that real women are expressing themselves. Again, this was very surprising to me. The classic doppelganger techniques are used to construct these kind of characters. So the same techniques I found were used to construct normative characters are used in a slightly different way to construct these sick characters, if you like. But unlike the normative characters, there's no harmony here. Whereas the other characters tend to find a solution to their problem, here there's no solution to be found apart from fighting between the two selves. So, some explicit examples. These are from Manga, Daifu, written by or made by Tsunobu Keiko in 2002 to 2007. This is about a middle school girl on this side. This is the first time she's harming herself. And to the other side is when she's become more accustomed to this behavior and she's carrying around her knife in her pocket. So looking at these kind of images, there's no doubt what this story is about. It is very explicit. Another example is the writer Kanehara Hitomi, who actually won the Akutagawa Prize, one of the finest prizes for literature in Japan. this is one of her books. Many of her earlier works deal with eating disorders and self-harm. And this is one of them called Ashu Baby or Ash Baby from 2004. And I took a quote out right after the main character is stabbing her own leg with a fruit knife, and then she says, "Why am I so dirty when my blood is so clean? Why am I so dirty and stupid?" So again, there's no doubt what this story is about. It's clearly about overcoming or dealing with eating disorders. Kanehara is one of those writers who are writing about her own experience. That's no secret. Just like Coco, she has given interviews, she's explained she has this problem herself, and that she's dealt with it. She's also said that when she writes, she wears these two small shoes with very tight, pointy toes and high heels because the pain makes her able to write better. So an example of eating disorders. This is from another manga by Ano Moyoko. And this is the protagonist who is an office lady, so she works in a company. And this is the first time she decides to make herself throw up. So again, this is very explicit, it's in your face kind of image that is probably very uncomfortable the first time you see it. I've seen it many times now. Another story, one of the earlier ones from 1989 by a very famous manga artist, Oshima Yumiko. It's called Daieto or Diet. This is about a high school student, Fuku or Fuku-chan, and she is fat and not feminine, and then she decides to exercise and she works out and she eats healthy or she eats nothing and transforms this transformation into this wonderful, beautiful, thin girl, and she gets a fan club at school, the boys are writing her letters, everything is fantastic, and she looks like this. She then starts developing issues with this, and this is her in the middle of a eating binge. She turns into this kind of monstrous character. I don't know how clear you can see it, but there's actually her teeth. She gets these devil teeth that sticks out, and she's clearly here turning into a like monstrous self. To the other side, she is caught by her mother in the middle of a binge in front of the refrigerator. In the end, this story, she backs and forth a few times, and then she is finally in a hospital bed, and the story ends. We don't really know whether she's going to overcome it or she will die. Embedded storylines. Those are stories that where the image of eating disorders and self-harm are not explicit as in the stories we've just seen. But they link characters to act of self-harm and eating disorders through their narrative. And I think the example I'm going to show you is one that many of you will know. Miyazaki Hayao's Spirited Away from 2001. Do you all know this story? No? Okay, some of you don't. Okay, I'll just give a brief story, and please chip in if I forgot something. So this is about a family moving to a new house. They end up in this alternative world because the father takes a wrong turn. In this world, there's all this food that the parents start eating, and the protagonist, a 10-year-old girl, Chihiro, she refuses to eat. She walks away, she comes back. The parents have transformed into pigs, and Chihiro now becomes responsible for rescuing them and getting them back to the normal world. In order to do so, she has to work hard in a bathhouse where she has to defeat several weird characters, among them this all-consuming monster character called Kaonashi. Chihiro eventually succeeds and becomes a hero. So these are some of the images in the scene where Chihiro refuses to eat with her parents. The images here are taken from the manga, or the comic strip rather than the film, because it's easier. Here the mother is inviting Chihiro to eat. Chihiro, for the first time, stands up to her parents. Until this point, she's been running after them, trying to keep up with them. At this point, she refuses to do what they say anymore, and she goes her own way, shaking her head violently. She walks off, she comes back. The parents have turned into pigs. She then enters the world, where she becomes professional in expelling the consumed. This is the character Kaonashi. Kaonashi first appears as this very thin, helpless character that shows up. Chihiro lets it into the bathhouse. It offers her some gold, which she refuses, and slowly it starts eating. She eats the different characters in the bathhouse, and eventually it's become this scary monster character that eats everything inside. And in order to keep the monster happy, the bathhouse workers have to keep feeding it. Everybody's scared of it, and Chihiro is given the job of trying to tame this monster. She's sent in front of the monster, and she gives it this herbal cake that she has from somewhere. It's a very complicated movie, but she has that herbal cake from somewhere, and she gives it to Kaonashi, and Kaonashi gulps it down and then vomits. And this scene is incredible. If you have seen the film, go back and see this scene. It's really something else. So, in this story, in Miyazaki's work, which obviously is not about eating disorders, eating is very dangerous. Humans become transformed into pigs if they eat, or at least if they eat too much. Fantastic characters may transform into monsters. The protagonist's heroism relies on two main competences. One, refusing to eat. That's how she avoids becoming a pig with her parents. And two, expelling the consumed. That's how she saves the entire bathhouse world by shedding the monster form. If we compare one of the images I showed you earlier, Fuko-chan from the manga, Oshima's manga, the high school girl who's in the middle of her binge, and Kaonashi in Miyazaki's story, there are also some clear references here. In fact, the storyline between these two stories seem to have something in common. Fuko-chan transforms from fat to thin to monster to fat to thin, whereas Kaonashi transforms from thin to monster to fat to thin, and both are pacified. Fuko-chan in her bed, Kaonashi with the housewife kind of twin sister. There are two twins in this story. Super interesting part, but I won't be able to go into that. But Kaonashi is pacified with the one who is very typical feminine. So while Miyazaki most likely did not intend to depict anorexia and bulimia, and in fact when I have given this talk at the conferences or other places where there has been fans of Miyazaki, I'm often told off and told that this is completely wrong. And I agree with them. I don't think Miyazaki intended this at all, which is not my point. My point is that this story is produced and consumed in a cultural setting, Japan, where eating disorders and self-harm are on the increase, and where such private experiences are becoming public discourse, consumed as information, lifestyle products, and entertainment. And in that setting, Miyazaki's anime also participates in such a discourse, unwillingly perhaps. So that's really what I wanted to say. I hope I managed to make sense of something that took a lot longer than 30 minutes to produce. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.